I forgot the sign-up sheet today, so heck with it. It's a Monday, what can you say? But I got them back in my office, I'm just too damn lazy to walk back. Or waste any class time, so. On Friday, we were talking about the end of the Great War, or World War as they were calling it as well, and the fact that Wilson is going to go to Europe and participate in the peace process. And the peace conference will be held at Versailles, even though it's officially known as the Paris Peace Conference. Versailles is right outside of Paris. It begins on the 18th of January, 1919. There are delegates from 27 of the victorious Allied powers, including Canada and Australia, I might add, for the first time acting as independent nations. The one Allied power that isn't represented is Russia. Why? Why, thank you. Yes. They're in the middle of the Bolshevik Revolution and Russian Civil War. So there are no Russian delegates at Versailles. The losers send representatives, but they're not allowed to participate. It's, in essence, a dictated peace. This is not a negotiation. And it isn't the 27 Allied nations dictating the peace. It's largely the, quote, big three. And what are who are those? Who are the big three? What nations? Oh, and one of them should be a Guinea. Actually, all three. Please? Thank you. There's one right there. Huh? That's second one. Way to go, man. Got the trifecta, all three. United States, Great Britain, and France. Italy, their Prime Minister Orlando was there, and he thought it would be the big four, but they largely ignored him. So it's going to be the representatives of the United States, Great Britain, and France. Wilson, David Lloyd George of Great Britain, and Georges Clemenceau for the French. Neither Lloyd George nor Clemenceau particularly liked Wilson when they first met him. They thought he was rather self-righteous and arrogant, and they were right. Clemenceau, the old pragmatist, he was about 83 years old at the conference. He remarked about Wilson and his self-righteous attitude. Remember Wilson's 14 points? Clemenceau remarked, "Mon Dieu, God only gave Moses 10 commandments. Who's this Wilson with his 14 points?" As the conference wore on, they were impressed with Wilson's sincerity, his intellect, and his idealism. So by the end of the conference, all three men pretty much liked and respected each other. But working together, they will pretty much dictate the peace. Now, all three have conflicting agendas. They have things that don't necessarily go along. Wilson wants an idealistic peace. He wants it based on his 14 points. He wants a league of nations. He wants self-determination for peoples. He wants disarmament. He'll get some of that. Lloyd George, also a political pragmatist, he's not in this for idealism. He's in it for the British Empire. What can the Brits get out of this? And he has a wish list. They want Germany's African colonies. They want control of the Middle East, particularly the oil in Iran. And unfortunately for the British, they will get their wish. They will get control of the Middle East and rue the fact decades later. They'll be right in the middle of the mess in the 1940s. What do the French want? A nice croissant right now. Come on, what do the French want? Think about it. No, and they've had a few. They've had their share. They want revenge against Germany, and they want Germany to be rendered impotent, no longer a threat to France. All three sort of get what they want. The resulting treaty is more a series of compromises than anything else. France gets her wish in many ways. Germany is disarmed. The German army is reduced to 100,000 men, no tanks, no aircraft, no general staff. It's basically a lightly armed national police force. They lose Alsace and Lorraine to France, the so-called two lost provinces. Germany is also faced or forced to pay billions of dollars in war reparations to the Allied powers, mostly France and Belgium. By the way, it's payments Germany cannot afford. Their economy's wrecked. And the thing that really oh, by the way, they lose all of their overseas colonies. Great Britain grabs most of them. And the thing that really sticks in their craw is Article 231 of the treaty. The Germans have to admit the war was their fault, that they started it. And that was a very bitter pill for them to swallow. And the German people have never accepted it. By the way, over the years, especially because of some leading German historians in the 60s and 70s, the idea that Germany was responsible for World War I is now largely accepted, even in Germany. But it took 50, 60 years for that to happen. And this is going to have repercussions on World War II. Because the Germans are always going to feel like they were mistreated at Versailles and wrongly blamed for starting World War I. Britain gets a lot of what it wants, the old German Empire in Africa, and as I pointed out, control the Middle East. And again, as I pointed out, something they will regret. And Wilson gets the establishment of his cherished League of Nations, an international body representing all of the nations of the world where they can come together and solve their problems in peace. He also, to some degree, by the way, this is the territory Germany lost in the war. Germany was, this is Alsace and Lorraine right here. They also lost this to Denmark, this to Poland. But all of these countries here had once been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And they all emerged, as well as these countries that had been part of the old Russian Empire, they all emerged for the first time in centuries as independent nations. So self-determination for peoples does occur in Europe. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Lithuania, all of these countries emerged because of the war. There are limits to Wilson's idealism and self-determination of peoples. The British and French were quite willing, quite happy as a matter of fact, to see a lot of these new nations emerge in Europe. They don't feel the same way about self-determination for the non-white peoples of their empires in Africa and Asia. Doesn't apply to them. And I'll give you a good example. During the conference, there was a Vietnamese delegation in Paris. Vietnam, back then, was a colony of France's. They controlled it. And there were a lot of Vietnamese in France because of that. This group was there trying to influence the peace negotiations. One of the leading members of the delegation was a Vietnamese named Nguyen Quoc. And by the way, that was not his real name, that was a pseudonym. In Vietnamese, it means Nguyen the Patriot. He truly believed in Wilson's idealism, and he wanted to meet the great American president to argue in behalf of Vietnamese independence. Wilson refused to meet him, in part because Wilson was a racist, and in part because Clemenceau and the French asked him not to. So, if you were a third world peoples back then, self-determination did not apply to you, did not apply to the Vietnamese. By the way, we will meet him again later in the class under a different name. Nguyen Quoc was one of 30 different pseudonyms that we know about anyway, that he had used in his lifetime. But you probably know him best by the last one he assumed, Ho Chi Minh. Have you heard that name before? Vietnam War? Mm-hmm. I always wondered what would have happened had Wilson actually listened to him, or if the Americans would have pressured the French to give the Vietnamese more independence. It wasn't going to happen. So self-determination of peoples only went so far. And by the way, that included the Middle East. Yeah.
Vietnam was?
Yeah.
Same one?
Same guy.
New Wilson?
Yeah. Yeah, he was. He was in his probably late 70s when he died in 1969.
Making sure the same thing.
Yeah. You know what? A lot of Vietnamese didn't think so as well. I don't want to go into it, but one of the reasons is because he kept changing his name, but because the British accidentally reported Nguyen Quoc had died of tuberculosis in a Hong Kong hospital. So that allowed him to assume a totally new identity to escape the French. Because he was a wanted man by the French later on as a revolutionary. But no, that was him, same guy. Born in Nguyen Thap Van in central Vietnam in 1890. And we'll get into that in several weeks, actually. Now, on the 28th of June, 1919, the German leaders of the new Weimar Republic reluctantly, under duress, signed the Treaty of Versailles. Notice anything about that date, 28th of June, 1919? 5 years to the day of the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which started the whole war. How's that for symmetry? As I pointed out, it saw the birth of several new nations, but it saw the demise of 4 great empires. The German Empire, the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the old Ottoman Empire, what is now modern-day Turkey. Even the victors lose in this war. Both Britain and France emerged from the war bankrupt. France will also gain a defeatist attitude from the war. And when World War II breaks out, 20 some odd years later, they won't have the heart for it. They will collapse in 6 weeks. And part of that has to do with the tremendous suffering they suffered during World War I. So Britain and France are ruined economically for about a decade. Ironically, their economies don't reach pre-war levels again until the eve of the Great Depression. And then they collapse again. By the way, the Depression is also related to the war in many ways. Russia is in the midst of a horrible civil war. We'll see millions of people die, and the emergence of the first communist state. And 2 of the Allied powers, Italy and Japan, will feel cheated and ignored at Versailles. This will contribute to revolutions in both countries. In Italy, it'll contribute to the rise of Mussolini in fascism, and in Japan down the road, it'll contribute to the rise of militarism and put them on a collision course with us. So the repercussions of World War I actually play themselves out throughout the rest of the 20th century. Even today, we still feel ripples of it in many ways. Wilson returns home in triumph, but things then begin to go badly. The Senate begins to debate the treaty, and naturally they want to make some changes in it. Many of them are probably beneficial, actually. But Wilson, being the moralist and being obstinate and bullheaded, refuses to make any changes. Now, there were about 18 senators that weren't going to vote for the treaty no matter what. They were known as irreconcilables. So there was no way Wilson was going to win them over. But there were several others, probably about 24 or more, that considered themselves, quote, reservationists, which meant they would be happy to vote for the treaty if Wilson would make certain changes. And as I pointed out, the changes they wanted were largely reasonable and pragmatic. It's not like it would have gutted the treaty or anything. But Wilson remains obstinate, forces a vote on the original treaty, and it fails. On the 19th of November, 1919, the treaty fails to get the necessary 2/3 vote. Came close,
Remember, a treaty doesn't need just a simple majority, it needs a 2/3 vote for it to pass. And they lost by several votes. So the United States never ratifies the Treaty of Versailles, which Wilson had a huge voice in shaping, and we have to make a separate peace with Germany 2 years later. The other problem is we never joined the League of Nations as a consequence. So again, Wilson's great idealistic brainchild for the world, and we don't even join it. That's one reason, there are many, but that's one reason the League eventually fails. Now, there were domestic repercussions of the war even after the war's end. There was labor unrest, over 3,600 labor strikes in 1919 alone. A lot of it had to do with the government's botched handling of the economy during the war. There was discontent over the suppression of civil liberties and fear over the greatest plague that had hit humankind since the Black Death, the Spanish influenza we talked about. In 1919, you see the beginning of the first Red Scare. The declaration of a Bolshevik, a communist state in Russia, caused, quite frankly, undue hysteria and fear over here. The Russians were busy killing each other at that point. There was no threat it was going to spread here. But it does set off a wave of terrorist bombings. And the terrorists, by the way, probably were not communists. We're almost positive they were anarchists. There's a difference, believe it or not. On the 28th of April, 1919, 30 mail bombs are sent out to prominent officials. Nobody important is killed. Unfortunately, the maid for a Georgia senator opens one of the packages and it blows her hands off. Doesn't kill her, but still. One does narrowly miss the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Blew up on his porch minutes before he was supposed to arrive home. Think how that would have changed history. On the 2nd of June, a second wave of package bombs hits 8 cities, including the home of Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, and another bomb kills a night watchman. After that, the bombing ceased. No one was ever caught. The government was pretty sure it was the work of a handful of anarchists. But no one's ever caught, and it helped fuel the panic. The Attorney General, Palmer, who had presidential ambitions, responds to this by doing 2 things. One, in 1919, he needs somebody to do research, so he creates a very tiny, at the time, Bureau of Investigation. And it's headed up by an anonymous clerk in the research department named J. Edgar Hoover. This is the beginnings of the FBI. By the way, that same year, the American Civil Liberties Union was formed. It's a response to all the abuses during World War I, civil liberties. So I always thought it was kind of ironic that both the FBI and the ACLU were born in the same year. From November of 1919 to January of 1920, federal agents launched a series of raids in 33 cities. They're collectively known as the Palmer Raids. They raided numerous locations and arrested over 10,000 people. They seized thousands of pamphlets, books, and other literature, but fined a total of only 4 guns. So if they were going to try and overthrow America, they were going to do it by dropping a lot of paper on people. Only 4 weapons. The vast majority of people were innocent. Few are convicted, but about 556 are deported. Some for political activities, a lot of them for associated crimes that came out during the investigation. The raids initially made Palmer famous, but that soon fades. He'll get blamed for a lot of the controversy, and his bid for the Democratic nomination in 1920 will fail. Now, Wilson is not going to run for re-election in 1920. One, because like most previous presidents, he believed in Washington's dictum of 2 terms. Secondly, he was very ill. He was still recovering from the effects of his stroke. In fact, he probably never fully recovered. He'll die a few years later in the 1920s. So you have a wide open election, no incumbent. And those are usually the most fun. The Democrats, instead of A. Mitchell Palmer, nominate 2 progressives. Their presidential candidate is the governor of Ohio, James Cox. And their vice presidential candidate is the former Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Yes, before he was president, he was a vice presidential candidate. Cox was a very successful governor, but he lacked charisma. I mean, he doesn't look like the most exciting person in the world, does he? He isn't. He wasn't a particularly good campaigner either. Roosevelt's going to carry the campaign for him. Now, the Republicans that year had, for a change, a rather contentious convention. The kingmakers in the Republican Party didn't want another conservative, didn't want another progressive. Teddy Roosevelt was enough for them. They wanted a conservative they could safely control. The problem was the 2 leading candidates, Leonard Wood and Hiram Johnson of California, were both ardent progressives. So the conservatives in the Republican Party stalemate, deadlock the nomination. They go through 10 ballots and can't pick a candidate. That night, the kingmakers in the proverbial smoke-filled room, and I'm not kidding, it was a hotel room in Chicago where they were holding their convention, and all of them were in there smoking cigars, and they called in a minor but ambitious candidate from Ohio, Warren G. Harding. He was a senator. He's what we call a dark horse candidate. You know what that means? What's a dark horse candidate? It was a minor contender that comes out of nowhere to win the race. That's a dark horse. Going into the convention, even though Harding had said that he was a candidate, nobody had taken him very seriously. Now, all of a sudden, he's going to emerge as a Republican candidate. The kingmakers felt he was safe. So on the 11th ballot, Harding gets the nomination. And the convention picks the rather colorless governor of Massachusetts, Calvin Coolidge, as his running mate. And by the way, you couldn't have picked two totally different types of people, as we shall see. So one way or the other, folks, you're going to get a president from Ohio that year, either Cox or Harding. And here's Harding. Now, the conservatives got their candidate and then quickly found out he came with a lot of baggage. Harding was a notorious womanizer. And he was in the middle of a torrid affair with a woman named Carrie Phillips, the wife of his best friend. If that would have gotten out back then, that would have been a nightmare for them. And by the way, Carrie Phillips herself was a nightmare. Even during World War I, she was rabidly pro-German and tried to convince Harding to vote against American participation in World War I. The Republicans wanted to get rid of her during the election, so she successfully blackmails them. Her lovely parting gifts included a cruise around the world to the Pacific and Asia, and a yearly stipend from the party. Hush money. The blackmail threat was based on a rather large number, over 1,000 pages, of love letters Harding had written to her on official government stationery. He wasn't very smart in some respects, was he? They were never made public during her life. She died in 1960. But government now has control of them. They're owned by the National Archives. And in 1914, they put them online. So if you want to read some really horrible love letters, you can go online and read Harding's love letters to Carrie Phillips. They're worth a good laugh if you read a few of them. They really are. And by the way, he's going to actually end up doing far worse than having an affair with his best friend's wife. And here's his best friend. And here's Carrie. And as I pointed out, either way, you're going to get a president from Ohio. Now, the election of 1920 was the first election in which women could vote nationwide. And they took their new duties very seriously. These are women voting in Boston. Let me turn the light off for a second. See if you can take a look at the face on a couple of those guys watching them in the background. It might be hard to tell, especially from back there, but if you go online, some of those guys look just appalled. You know, like, what's this world coming to? Women are voting. The women did vote in large numbers. But we can't blame them for Harding. Harding will win by a landslide. He wins 60% of the popular vote. Poor James Cox wins a little under 35%. And here's the vote. Again, you can see regional patterns. With the exception of Tennessee and Oklahoma, most of the solid South, again, went Democratic. Which is kind of ironic. The very conservative South voted for the progressive, and the normally progressive Northeast voted for a conservative. Well, how did Harding get elected? Well, in part because he had promised, quote, a return to normalcy. And by the way, that's a real word. He didn't make it up. The nation was suspicious and fearful and uncertain about America's new role in the world. Remember, Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson had pretty much revolutionized our place in world politics. The war had scared people. The communist revolution in Russia had scared people. And the nation was tired of crusades, reform, domestic upheaval, and wanted unrealistically to return to a simpler time. Part of it was nostalgia, turn the clock back, when we weren't facing some of these problems. Well, stuff like that can get you elected. The problem is you can't do it. You can't turn back the clock. The world was never the way it was going to be before the progressive reforms and the Great War. It just wasn't going to happen. So people voted in part for a fantasy. Harding promised them something that he or anyone else could ever deliver. Harding's election signaled the beginning of a conservative period in American politics. It'll last roughly the next 13 years. The progressive movement dies nationally. It does survive regionally in some places, survives in Cincinnati up through the 1920s. There were several reasons for the end of the progressive movement. And by the way, these are reasons that often kill most reform movements in America, not just the progressive movement, at least successful ones. To begin with, the progressives had accomplished at least their major goals. Remember, they had added 4 new amendments to the Constitution, passed a series of laws protecting workers and children and women, consumer safety, things like that. Like a lot of reform movements, they're not sure where to go next. What do you do next? The civil rights movement, the New Deal later on will face the same problems. Secondly, Americans often embrace reform at the beginning, but like a lot of things, we tire of it. And sooner or later, people want an end. They want to see how everything's going to work out, and this, quote, return to normalcy, which never happens. Third, key leaders of the progressives were either retiring, Wilson's retired, La Follette's retired, or they're dying. Teddy Roosevelt dies in 1919. He had a bad heart. And last but not least, the war. Wars kill a lot of things. In American history, they kill reform movements. The populists, one of the things that's going to lead to their demise was the Spanish-American War. World War I contributes to the demise of the progressives. World War II would contribute to the demise of the New Deal. And down the road, the Vietnam War would contribute to the demise of Johnson's Great Reform Program, the Great Society. So wars often kill reform in America. For all these reasons, the progressive movement dies in the early 1920s. Now, Harding will go down in history as one of the absolute worst presidents we ever had. Historians more recently give him some credit for his support of labor, women, and African American rights, but aside from that, he's largely considered a horrible president. He was not a reformer, and when he was elected, did not have an outstanding or even a distinguished political career. He basically became president because he was a survivor, and they kept electing him to higher offices. But he never did anything in his entire political career that made him notable. Not a thing. He was the owner and publisher of the Marion Daily Star. He was a journalist by profession. And despite the fact he was a rotten president, he was a nice guy. He was very likable. He was generous. He was generally kind to people. He was very good to his workers at the Star. Long before it was common, they had benefits such as retirement plans and paid vacations. They had health care. That was unheard of. So Harding personally was a nice guy. People liked him, friendly. Women considered him handsome. He was very distinguished looking. He looked like a president. And probably one of the most important things of all, well, not really, but he liked dogs. How can you hate anybody that likes dogs? And conversely, I'm always suspicious of people that don't. Anyway, that's Harding with his pet dog, Laddie. And the American public loved that dog. It got more fan mail than he did, and probably would have made a better president. But in many ways, that was Harding's public image to people. He was more like your distinguished grandfather than anything else. Little did they realize what he was really like, or what he was up to. By the way, he was married. His wife was named Florence, but everybody called her the Duchess. And Harding was a stout supporter of prohibition in public. In private, he took neither his marriage nor prohibition seriously at all. He violated both routinely. He makes an effort at being a good president. In July of 1921, he signs the Knox-Porter Congressional Resolution, ending our state of war with Germany. Remember, I said it was 2 years after Versailles before we make a separate peace. In November of 1921, he signs into federal law the first child welfare program in American history, the Shepard-Towner Act, provided federal funds for maternity and child care. And it was really a revolution in government health care for women. By the way, I went to graduate school with one of the historians that's done most of the primary work on the importance of the Shepard-Towner Act. And in 1921, he pardons Eugene V. Debs. Remember, Debs had been sentenced to 10 years in prison for questioning the Espionage and Sedition Acts. Harding brought him to the White House, interviewed him, said this man is absolutely no threat to the Republic, and made sure he was released before Christmas that year. He also oversaw the Washington Naval Conference. It was the first attempt to follow through on disarmament. One of the things that had caused World War I was the arms race, particularly the naval race between the British and the Germans. This was an attempt to put the genie back in the bottle, to limit the size and power of the world's navies. Much like we try and do in the 60s and 70s, even today, with nuclear weapons. Back then it was naval armaments. And by the way, most powers end up signing what becomes known as the Washington and London naval treaties that come out of this. It fixes the size of navies, says how big certain ships can be and how many you can have. It sets a ratio. It favors the great naval powers, though. The United States and Great Britain, for every 5 battleships they're allowed to own, Japan's only allowed to own 3. It limits certain number of submarines, aircraft carriers, things like that. It's a noble attempt to prevent future wars. But all it does is irritate several nations, including Japan. They signed the treaty, but they were never happy about it, and they didn't want to be second class in the United States. So it was a noble attempt that backfired. As I pointed out, Harding tries to be a good president. He also makes some good choices to his cabinet. He picks Herbert Hoover as his Secretary of Commerce, Charles Evans Hughes as his Secretary of State, for example, and Henry C. Wallace as his Secretary of Agriculture. And by the way, you will hear the name Henry Wallace again in here several times in the future, but it won't be this guy, it'll be his son. His son will be Secretary of Agriculture under FDR, and later Vice President of the United States. Now, despite trying to be a good president, Harding is going to be a huge failure, and a large part of it is due to his own vices. As one observer remarked, Harding was not a bad man. He was just a slob. Despite his public image as a happily married man and a teetotaler, as I pointed out, he's a womanizer and a heavy drinker. He likes to party. He likes to play poker. And by the way, I do not consider that one a vice by any means. It's a very noble game. A lot of presidents liked poker. Harry Truman liked it. You just don't spend a lot of your administration doing it. Or playing golf, for that matter. Despite his support for prohibition, you could always get a good drink in the White House. The liquor flowed. And there was a speakeasy, that's an illegal saloon during Prohibition. There was one right down the street from the White House. And the police commissioner in Washington, D.C. had strict orders never to raid that speakeasy. You know why?
We got his food.
That's where he went to drink often. It'd be rather embarrassing to raid a speakeasy and have to arrest the President of the United States in the raid. That's upholding the law, isn't it? And while president, he had an affair with a 19-year-old girl, Nan Britton. And she will give birth to a daughter by him in 1919. She does publish her story after Harding dies in 1928, but the courts rule against DNA evidence has had the last laugh. She was the daughter of Harding. So how's that for a scandal? He used to have his Secret Service agents keep his wife out of the White House when he was having liaisons with her. And here's Nan Britton in later life. Harding's biggest problem had to do with the people he appointed to government. Aside from the few good appointments I mentioned, he filled most offices with his friends and cronies, and a lot of them were as corrupt as hell. They were known collectively, not all of them were from this great state, but they were known as the Ohio Gang. And probably the absolute worst of the bunch and the ringleader was the Attorney General, Harry Daugherty. The Attorney General, as you folks hopefully know, is supposed to be the top law enforcement official in the nation. And Daugherty was probably the most corrupt member of his cabinet and the ringleader of much of the other corruption. And since I'm out of time, we'll look at the corruption on Wednesday. I have a